This morning we're very lucky to have a couple of our local stars from University of South Australia, Associate Professor Tracey Bretag and Dr. Rowena Harper. They are going to speak to us about a strategic priority project that they're currently running on contract cheating in higher education. They've had a very successful survey and they have a very large amount of data, so it's a very exciting presentation for us. So I'll hand over to them after the welcome country slide. Thanks, good morning. I'd like to acknowledge, give you an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge that this meeting is being held on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and we pay our respects to the elders both past and present. So thanks very much, and I'll hand over to Associate Professor Tracey Bretag. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, well, first of all, welcome and thank you for getting up early. I know how hard that is. It was hard for me, I've got to say, getting up in the dark, so thanks. Muffins really just don't cut it. Hey, Jane. And thanks to everyone who's listening and watching overseas and interstate. Great to have you. We're going to apologise straight away for anyone who came to our symposium. I think there are 1 or 2 people here. If so, get your muffin and go home. You're good. If you haven't heard this presentation before, hopefully you'll be interested in what we have to say. So as Stuart said, our project is contract cheating. Actually, it's called Contract Cheating and Assessment Design, Exploring the Connection. And what we're talking about today is the preliminary results from some large surveys which we've just completed of Australian staff and students. We have lots and lots of data, actually, that we're in the middle of analysing. But so take today with a bit of a grain of salt. It's preliminary, it's early days. We're still digging and trying to understand exactly what we have. So just to tell you a little bit about the project, we're really pleased that UniSA is the project lead with Rowena and I as project leaders. And our partners are Griffith University with Karen Van Haringen, the University of New South Wales with Kath Ellis, University of Sydney with Phil Rosenberg, Swansea University in the UK with Phil Newton, and our project manager, Sonia Siddiqui, also from UniSA. I've been talking about contract cheating for about 2.5 to 3 years now, and I had a slide which talked about all the things that are happening in higher education. And then as Rowena and I have sat chatting together every Monday, talking about this, what we finally came to term what's happening in higher education is that there's a perfect storm. A perfect storm has evolved, which has made it, one would say, almost perfect for contract cheating to become a critical issue. And so we keep just saying shorthand, the perfect storm. Now, this list is not exhaustive. There are so many elements you might want to add to it, but we've been talking about these as some of the fundamental things as part of this perfect storm which has created this ideal environment for contract cheating to flourish. The commercialisation, marketisation of higher education and the increasing competition across the sector. And that's not just in Australia, that's globally. The massification and internationalisation of higher education with the resultant and corresponding diversification of our student body. Now, I do want to say that this doesn't mean that any of these things in and of themselves are necessarily bad. Our whole project team are deeply committed to widening participation for higher education. Rowena and I have spent most of our careers talking about the benefits of internationalisation. We believe in that. We believe in having a diverse student body. But what we are saying is when we have an increasingly diverse student body, students for whom English may be an additional language, who come from different cultures, mature age students, students of different abilities, students who've had a break in their studies, and etc., the range of different types of things that our students are dealing with now. We have a very diverse student body, and I guess we would make the case that that very diverse student body has not necessarily had a corresponding amount of funding and support. The diverse student body has diverse needs and we need to support them. So we're not saying it's necessarily bad, but we're saying all these factors come together to create this perfect storm. We all know that technology has been changing at breakneck speed, and that creates disruption to the way we do things, to the way we think, to the way we act, and therefore there's been many changing social norms and values. And this, of course, that's not even thinking about intergenerational types of social norms and practices. We know, I'm looking around the room, with the exception of some cool young people in the room, excuse yourselves, generally academics in higher education tend to be of a different generation than our students, and we see things differently. We were raised differently in terms of the way we see education and the values and so on. So technology's had a huge impact on all of our practices, and it's had a huge impact on the way students see their learning. We know that we're under increasing pressure to perform with metrics and measurement the order of the day. Whatever you do, it has to be measured, and that goes back to that increasing competition which we're all struggling under. There are precarious job markets, and I don't just mean for our students. Our students are worried about the future. We tell them that the job you're studying for now probably won't exist by the time you graduate. We tell them that. We wonder why they're anxious. But there are precarious job markets also in higher education, with increasing casualisation, as we all know. Less and less security for academics, more and more staff who are existing on hourly pay or short-term contracts. Again, not saying that these people are responsible in any way for contract cheating, but what we're saying is a lot of these factors come together and create this perfect storm. Coming along with all of those things, we see corruption in wider society all the time. International leaders acting without ethics. We see scandals in the media all the time. Our students see that that's the way business gets done, and we even hear people around us saying that. And lastly but not least, great grammar this morning. As I say, this is not an exhaustive list. Perhaps we're a little bit guilty ourselves. We keep talking about the importance of employability and employability skills, and we tell our students as parents and as teachers, you've got to get a degree, you've got to go to university, or you'll never get a job. And so not surprisingly, our students have that employability focus. And they start to see, well, I'll get that degree, and that will equal I'll get a job. It can't be surprising then that they say, I'll pay for this course and I'll pass. They're starting to see learning as a transaction. I go to university, I turn up to class, I pay my fees, I get the grade, I get my degree. And so instead of learning being seen as a transformational experience, something that will change someone's life and allow them to make a contribution to society, they're seeing it as a transaction, which will allow them to get a job. Now again, that's just a few ideas. I'm sure you're all thinking of many, many other things, but we're talking about a sector which is, I guess, one doesn't want to be too dramatic, but in crisis. All these things have come together, and now we find ourselves dealing with contract cheating. On top of these changes across the sector, I've also been talking for the last couple of years. I'm going to thank Rowena for making this little timeline for me. The last couple of years, we've seen some really big scandals in the Australian sector, and in fact, across the world they've had comparable scandals, but I'll talk about Australia. Most of us will remember the MyMaster scandal. Nod if you're with me. Shake your head if you're thinking, what the hell is that? Okay, there's a few what the hell. Just for those at home or overseas, the MyMaster scandal was a really big thing in sort of late 2015, where a large number of students, hundreds of students, particularly in the Eastern Coast, were exposed by the Fairfax media as having used an online cheat site, a commercial cheat site called MyMaster. Now, it happened that that scandal occurred in the Eastern States. I remember the media talking to me about it and saying, oh, so does that happen in South Australia? And I'm like, well, yeah, as if, of course, we all know. And they're like, what? This is news. So it was big, big news. MyMaster happened to be the thing that focused everyone's attention. But it was happening with lots of other commercial providers as well. Around the same time, we had a scandal around fake testimonies and transcript mills. So we found that now we could, the scandal in the media was that students could just go online and buy parchments that looked exactly like the universities that they were supposedly have graduated from, with the beautiful watermarks and all the security encrypted. So that was a shock. As a result, the Independent Commission Against Corruption did an exploration about corruption in higher education and looked at fraudulent recruitment practices, and in particular they were looking at some of the dodgy issues around international students and the way that students are being recruited and how they're being supported and being allowed to enter the universities. So not surprisingly, around this time, our national regulator, TEXA, the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency, sent a request to all higher education providers across the Australian higher education sector to provide an assurance of academic integrity. People had to actually, universities, particularly those embroiled in the MyMaster scandal, had to get back to TEXA and say, these are all the things we do to make sure that our students are doing what they say, that they're graduating with integrity, that they're not cheating, and so on. It just went on. SBS did a Pens for Hire documentary. If you haven't seen it, do a little Google. It's still available to look at. What was shocking about that documentary was that it showed students not just outsourcing assignments, as we'd had the big scandal with my master, but outsourcing their whole degree. And it was shocking. One of the things that stood out for me was an international student who said, I came to Australia with every goodwill. I really wanted to study. I wanted to do well. But my first semester, I failed everything. I had no choice but to go and get some professional help. And from that moment on, the student outsourced every assignment and got through their degree. And there were many other examples of that like that in the documentary. Around the same time, and I'm sure you remember, it's been ongoing for some time, some of the fraudulent recruitment practices and low standards and dodgy things happening in the VEC sector. Simon Birmingham's had a lot to say about that, and I think they've been responding to queries and concerns about that. But really big concerns in our vocational education sector, right along with ghost students. Hundreds of students being recruited to take dodgy so-called online courses and not a single student ever hitting a keystroke. Certainly no one learning anything or graduating. And as recently as February this year, just a couple of months ago, we had another little scandal in the press around Airtasker. Now, those of you who don't know Airtasker, that's probably because you're over 40 with me. But it's just another outsourcing, sort of a business where you can actually go online and you can organise for people to do all the things that you want them to do. Pick up your dry cleaning, walk the dog and so on. But somebody who's working for Airtasker, talk to your husband at night, cook dinner, Jane. Somebody who was actually working for Airtasker was actually upset and blew the whistle to TEXA and said, look, I'm upset. There are students asking us to do their assignments for them. That's not what Airtasker is about. And there was a whole big question in the media about what is okay to outsource. Is that if it's okay to outsource your cleaning and it's okay to outsource your driving or whatever, why not your writing? So that was very recently. So it goes on, and I bet you today, if we went online, we could find another scandal happening somewhere. So it's endlessly in the press. It's endlessly on our minds. Certainly here at UniSA, it's endlessly been on my mind as the director of the Office for Academic Integrity in the Business School. These are some of the notices we see around the place. The very first one you'll see in the top left corner of your screen. We came into UniSA, this is about a year ago now, and those notices from the backs of toilet doors, on the seats, everywhere, all around. What upset me particularly about that notice, other than the fact that it's in Chinese, so we had to get someone to translate for us, is they're not just offering to students, so my translating friend tells me, they're not just saying to students, we'll do your work for you, they're also recruiting. You can see down here, you can't with you can see down the bottom, it says D and HD. Apparently what they're doing is saying, if you're a distinction or high distinction student, would you like a job as a writer? So they're not just corrupting us, our students and giving them the work, they're also corrupting our good students and trying to get them involved in the industry as well. Lots of other things you can see on there. There's banners on around town. There's freelance editors and tutors who think they're doing a legitimate job. That one in the bottom left corner, I actually rang her. And she's like, no, I'm really helping. And I was like, well, why are you saying that you're going to add content for students then? That's not editing. So there's even some people who are thinking they're actually doing a legitimate job and they've crossed over. And then there's ones which are so obviously illegitimate. They're not illegal, I should say, but they're certainly unethical, where they're offering for students to, you can see in the bottom right corner, you go online and you say, hey, I've got 10 pages, I'm going to write it in history. I need it written on this topic, and you can calculate the price of your essay that's going to be written for you. There's also file sharing sites like ThinkSwap and Sudoku, which are using, you can see, our own logos. That is not a legitimate site, but you can understand how our students might be confused when they see that UniSA logo. They think, hey, this is a UniSA note sharing site. Fabulous, I'll use that. And they find themselves down a slippery slope, which I'm going to explain in a minute what we mean by the slippery slope. So that's just a very small example. If you want to go online and have a look at these, there are hundreds of these in Australia, thousands across the world. So what is contract cheating? I mean, there's different definitions, and certainly in the early 2000s, Lancaster and Clark tended to define it as when you purchase an assignment from a commercial site. You purchase it from someone else, you outsource it to a commercial provider. That definition has now expanded, and certainly we have taken an expanded view of it. And just reading it with you, where a student gets someone, a third party, someone else, to complete an assignment or an exam for them. The third party could be a friend, a family member, fellow student, a staff member, somebody they know, to do it as a favour. It might be a pre-written assignment they get on a file sharing site or an essay mill. It also might be, the third party also might be a paid service, advertised locally or online. So it covers any time where a student outsources their work to a third party, whether they pay for it or not. For us, there's little distinction if a student is outsourcing their learning. And I'll say another thing about that the reason we've taken an expanded view, and I think it's important, certainly in relation to my own work, when we are dealing with students who have been called in on an academic integrity investigation, 2 years ago they spent a long time trying to persuade us I didn't pay for it, as if that made it all okay. And we've had to say, listen, you outsourced your work to a third party, and then staff would say, but I can't prove they bought it. So no, you don't need to prove they bought it. What we need to prove, what the student needs to prove, is that they achieved the learning outcomes. If they can't demonstrate the learning, they can't demonstrate that they've written this assignment, then they've outsourced that to us as contract cheating. So that's why we've taken an expanded view. It's almost immaterial to me about whether a student has paid for it or not, although it does hurt us more. For some reason, it does hurt us. The research questions in our project, we wanted to know how prevalent it is in Australian higher education. There's been a few studies around the world, but nothing in Australia to say exactly what's happening. What are staff and student attitudes towards it and their experiences? And what are the various factors that are correlated with contract cheating? And importantly, what kinds of assessments are associated with contract cheating? Because I'm sure you've all heard this idea you can design out cheating in your assessment. Now, we've started on the premise that that's actually a myth, and I'll take you through. It's not that assessment design is not absolutely important, it is. Rowena and I both believe in assessment design being a critical part of the teaching and learning environment, but we don't think that's going to solve the problem of contract cheating. It's going to be one part of a multi-pronged approach. We did parallel staff and student surveys at 8 universities and 4 non-university pathway colleges. We've also got a large data set of procurement requests, and Rowena will take you through the detail of that, but that have been posted to multiple cheat sites, and it shows the types of assessments which have been commonly outsourced. We also have data from 2 universities who very kindly and anonymously provided their academic integrity data, so we could actually look at which types of assessments were either purchased or outsourced according to the breach report data. So quite a lot of data. We believe we have the largest data set in the world on this topic. So just to clarify a little further about what we were looking at, I wish I could show you by pointing, but I can't. It doesn't work on the screen. So there are 7 behaviours that we explored. And you can see the first 2, we're calling those sharing behaviours. Now, if you buy, sell or trade notes, we think it's a little problematic. It's not bad. I mean, I'm going to share my notes with Rowena before an exam. You know, students have been doing that for a long time. What we are concerned about is perhaps that behaviour we might find students using online buying, selling and trading note sites, leading them down a path to where they then buy it. We were concerned that that might happen, so we asked students about that behaviour, not suggesting that it was cheating. We just called it sharing. The second behaviour, providing a completed assignment for any reason. Now, we know that if you provide an assignment to someone else and you know they're going to submit it as their own work, that is cheating. But so often students say to us, no, I just provided it to help, or they said they wanted to look at the structure or whatever. And we know there are legitimate reasons for people to share their assignments. So we assumed, we made just that assumption that that was not a cheating behaviour, but I'll show you some data in a second, which might be interesting to you. We just said for any reason, we'll call that a sharing behaviour, knowing that that could be cheating, but we're not going to say it is. But these 5 other behaviours, we can say categorically, black and white, they are cheating behaviours. If you obtain a completed assignment with the intention of submitting it as your own, that's cheating. What do you reckon? Everyone nodding? Yeah? Anybody disagree with that? No, it's not the early morning. I'm not getting any feedback here. Providing and receiving exam assistance. Clearly that's cheating. And the last two, exam impersonation, either taking an exam for someone else or getting someone else to take it for you. So we thought, look, that is so black and white. Those 5 behaviours are cheating. The other 2, they may be dodgy, but we don't know. So let's just assume for now that they're sharing. So our survey, we had 14,086 respondents, and I'm just talking about the universities here, I should say, because I'm not going to report on the non-university pathways at the moment because they're a separate set. We actually have another more than 1,000 respondents from those students. 8 universities from 6 states, so a nice spread. More females than males, as you can see. Mostly young people under 25, as you can see from that spread. Mostly undergraduates. Mostly internal students with the blended and external and online. Mostly English-speaking students, although I think that sort of represents pretty closely the spread of international and domestic students in Australia, so that was actually pretty good. And we had, this is not because of any great planning on our part, bizarrely, we had exactly a 50-50 split on the Go8 and non-Go8 universities. So that was very handy. And one of the reasons that was important is in the media especially, there's a misconception that these issues only occur in the less elite universities. We hear people in, you know, the group of 8 saying, oh, that wouldn't happen at our place. Oh, guys. So we, you know, so our gut feeling was, and we have people on our project who are from, you know, G8 universities, our gut feeling was that that was not going to be true, that we were going to see it everywhere, and you'll have some fun looking at the data in a sec. So how prevalent is it? That was our first question. Well, 6% of the respondents, that was 814 students, reported that they had engaged in one or more of those 5 cheating behaviours. 6. Now, you might think that's not so high. In fact, that correlates pretty well to the international literature on this. It ranges anything from 3 to 8%, 6, 7%. So we're like, oh, we feel like we're on the money because that matches what the literature has said elsewhere. So when we look at sharing, though, if we were to add that sharing behaviour, which remember we just assumed is not cheating, 27% of our respondents said that they provide an assignment to somebody else for any reason. 27%. Now, I don't think I have this data on my slides just because we can't cover everything, but I think from memory it's 65% or 68% of the students who said they obtained an assignment from a friend did submit it as their own. So we need to get this information out for students. You think you're sharing with your friend, you think you're being altruistic, chances are around 2/3 of those guys are going to submit it as their own. So think twice. It's not just sharing. When somebody then goes and submits it, that becomes cheating. That's when the line is crossed. So we referred to this 6% as our cheating group, and we analysed them as a separate subgroup. So the nature of our cheating behaviours. So remember, we're just talking about the cheating group now. That's 6%. 53%, so around half of the cheating group provided exam assistance, or 41% received it. We were very interested to find out how often people were using a professional service, because there's this, you know, there is certainly a sense that there's a lot more commercial providers being used, all that marketing material around the campus. Only 10% odd of the cheating group said they had actually used a professional service. By and large, as you can see by the numbers there, they're still using the work of other students or family members and friends and so on. We asked if there was money exchange, which is a slightly different question because you may not use a commercial provider, but you may pay your friend. And you can see in the case of obtaining a completed assignment to submit, around 13% said they provided money for that. But look at this number on the taking an exam for someone else, 16.7%. Fair enough. If you're going to do an exam for someone else, you probably do want to get paid for it, right? That's a big job. That's much more than being a friend. So even if they're not using a commercial provider, in this number of cases, depending on the type of breach, they are still exchanging money. But I think the thing to remember from this slide is that the issue is still that students are using other students' work and former students' work, which is why the tools we have, such as Turnitin, Because you might have heard, oh, we can't use Turnitin anymore, it doesn't help us because people are outsourcing to bespoke essay mills. In fact, tools like Turnitin text matching software are still useful because if they're using former students' work and other students' work, chances are it's going to come up as well. You're going to see it. So keep checking the Turnitin reports, knowing it's never been a magic bullet. It's still a useful tool. So looking at those sharing behaviours, back to our slippery slope hypothesis. Yes, Rowena's telling me, and I'm going to be so quick. 5 minutes, I'm gone. So that she can talk to you about the stuff. We had this hypothesis that students who tended to use those note sharing sites may be more likely to engage in the cheating behaviours. So we found that our cheating group, twice as likely to use the note sharing sites than the non-cheating group. They were also twice as likely to provide an assignment for any reason. Yep. The numbers weren't quite so high, but we certainly saw more cheating students using file sharing sites than non-cheating students. Our cheating group, this is them. Well, an abbreviated version because we have lots of other demographics. We can say males are overrepresented in the cheating group. Engineering students, as you can see there, they were 13% of our overall sample, but 24.6% of our cheating sample. So engineering students are overrepresented in the cheating group. Those students who speak a language other than English at home, they were 21% of our overall sample, but over 40% of the cheating group. They were overrepresented. Now this is interesting, looking at the group of 8 and non-group of 8, remember we had a 50-50 split, we had slightly more GO8 students involved in the cheating group, although we've actually gone and got some additional statistical support on this to try to dig down, and sorry for those in the room who are hoping for a different story, it doesn't look like that's statistically significant. But what it does say is it's happening there as well. This is not a non-GO8 issue. Our internal students were the most likely to be involved in cheating, and our international students, as you can see, were 15% of our overall sample, but 33% of the cheating group. So males, engineering, language other than English, international, and internal students, face-to-face students. Very quickly, we compared people's attitudes towards cheating, because very often we hear people say, hey, it's cultural. People from different countries, they don't see it as wrong. Well, in fact, our international and our LOT, language other than English students, they had very comparable attitudes to our domestic students. They all thought it was wrong. You can see in terms of the cheating and non-cheating behaviours, towards the sharing and cheating behaviours, the biggest difference here in terms of level of wrongness, in every case, the non-cheating group students thought it was more wrong, but in relation to providing and receiving exam assistance, the non-cheating students thought it was most wrong. We asked students about their perceptions of the teaching and learning environment, a whole range of factors there, 10 of them, and 3 factors stood out as having an influence, so I'm going to take you to this, an influence on their cheating behaviours. We call this the personalised teaching and learning relationship because it related to individualised learning and teaching interactions. Students want to know their teachers. They said they want their lecturers and their tutors to really make sure they understand their assignment requirements. They want more feedback and they want opportunities to approach their lecturers. So the teaching and learning relationship is the thing. We asked them about assessment design, and I'm almost on the last slide, Rowena, I'm going to hand over to you. We asked the students to rate the likelihood that a student would consider getting someone else to complete this kind of assessment for them. Now, it's pretty hard, isn't it? It's hypothetical. We're asking a whole group of students, most of whom don't cheat, to say, what do you reckon? Which would be more likely to be outsourced? Yeah, now keep in mind, the only other research we know, which is something like this, was in the UK, and they asked students hypotheticals, would you be willing to buy an assignment? And they gave them all these scenarios. 50% of their sample, only 90, said they would be willing to buy an assignment, depending on the circumstances. So that was sort of our thinking here. You can see here all the different types of assessments we asked about, and you can see that the ones that the students all said were the least likely. No one said that they weren't going to be able to outsource anything. There was nothing that had a 0. We would have thought if it was a Viva or it was in class, you'd say, very completely unlikely to outsource, but no, everyone said they could still be outsourced. But you can see the difference here between the cheaters and the non-cheaters. So the non-cheating students thought it was very low chances of outsourcing this work, but the cheating students still were up here over 20%, even for something where it's completed in class. That goes back to the pens for hire, knowing that you can get exam impersonators and people to do all your work for you. Now, Rowena's going to talk some more about this because this relates back to the staff and what the staff are doing in terms of their assessment. So just keep those in mind. Those 4 assessments can be outsourced, but they're less likely to be. Okay, I'm going to just give some technology to Rowena, so give us a moment, and she's going to talk to you about the staff survey. This one first.
Alrighty, can you hear me? All good? Excellent. All right. So the staff survey data I think is interesting in itself, but also particularly interesting for the ways in which it compares to the student survey data. Over 1,100 staff completed the staff survey. The gender profile is roughly representative of that in Australian higher ed, and we had a pretty good representation across all our other demographic groups as well, and also pretty good representation across our discipline groupings. You know, we've got lots of staff, lots of students. We had pretty good representation from staff. So we think it was fairly representative. The first questions we asked staff were about their experiences with dealing with and managing a range of cheating behaviours in their contexts. And with regard to outsourced assignments, so that's the student getting somebody else to do their work for them, 68% of staff said that they'd suspected this at some point in their teaching career. And of those, 40% said they suspected it more than 5 times. When we asked staff to indicate what it was that prompted their suspicions of outsourcing, the educator's knowledge of the student was the most common signal. So either their knowledge of their language ability or of their academic ability. Turnitin was still a really useful tool, but it was less common a signal than educators' knowledge of the student. When we asked what the typical response was for cases of outsourced assessment, only 56% of staff referred the cases to an AI decision maker. About 8% of staff reported that their typical response was to actually ignore it altogether. The remaining 36% of staff handle it themselves, applying a really broad range of penalties. For the 44% of staff who don't refer cases onto an AI decision maker, we asked them why that was. And the most common response was that these kinds of cases are impossible to prove. And other common responses included, you know, it's too time consuming to pursue, takes a lot of time and effort, and staff don't feel supported by senior management to pursue these issues. That was another common one. We then asked staff who do refer cases on to AI decision makers how often these cases are substantiated, and when they are, what's the typical outcome for a student outsourcing their work. And about a third of staff who refer cases on aren't typically informed about further developments in the case. And a further third, however, report that their cases were substantiated between 90 and 100% of the time. So to some extent, this challenges that perception among some staff that contract cheating is impossible to prove. In fact, it's substantiated quite a lot of the time if you've got an experienced academic integrity officer working on the case. But I think one of the problems was staff weren't well informed about what happened with their cases. So it seems like, you know, if we're going to increase referral rates, you know, we need to be informing staff about what actually happens with cases so that the whole process is transparent and they know what goes on. A final question we asked in relation to outsourced assessment was about the typical penalties applied to these kinds of cases. And staff were able to select from a whole range of items. For example, you know, there might be a couple of outcomes that are applied if a student gets 0 for the assignment and they're also referred to a learning advisor, for instance. The most common outcome reported by staff was a warning or counselling in 30% of cases. The next most common was 0 for the task or a reduced mark. When you look at the academic integrity literature, the sector tends to agree that the most appropriate outcome for cases like this is suspension, and most universities tend to report publicly that suspension is the minimum penalty they apply. But suspension was only reported in 3% of cases, and exclusion only in 2%. So it suggests that in practice, penalties are a lot more lenient than perhaps they should be. So I'll address the behaviours of exam assistants and exam impersonation briefly. Only 7% of staff were aware of exam assistants having occurred in their courses. And I say only because in the student survey, this was the most common cheating behaviour reported by students, far more common than outsourcing of assessment. So of those, most had seen it only 1 to 2 times, but 9% had seen it more than 10 times. As with outsourced assessment, a significant proportion, about 23%, weren't informed of the penalty. And of those that were, 36% reported that the outcome included 0 for the exam, 46% a warning, counselling. And given the wide-ranging nature of exam assistance, it could be someone just whispering a single answer to their neighbour in an exam hall, or someone, you know, with earpieces and eyepieces and, you know, someone assisting someone through technology with the whole exam. It's not surprising that the penalties were pretty wide-ranging here. 5% of staff reported that the more serious breach of exam impersonation had occurred in their courses, and again, most reported seeing it 1 or 2 times. Again, a large proportion weren't informed of the outcome. Those who were reported serious outcomes such as suspension or exclusion in only 16 and 12% of cases respectively. One final point to be made about these initial survey items relates to whether these cheating behaviours are recorded in the university's official database of academic integrity when they're discovered. And staff reported that database records are created in relatively few cases, meaning that students are more able to get away with repeated breaches and face little or no penalty. When asked about their perceptions of the prevalence of cheating behaviours in higher ed, a question that we mirrored in the student survey, staff were actually far more accurate than students about the numbers of students engaged in these behaviours at university. So the highest proportion of staff, that's the yellow bar there, the highest proportion estimated that between 1 and 10% of students are engaged in these behaviours, which according to our survey data is about what it is. Of course, students see things quite differently. Non-cheating students, who are the green bar, their estimates are spread more evenly across the 1 to the 30% range, but students in the cheating group tend to think cheating is far more common. So the bulk of their responses are in that sort of 61 to 90% range. So people who are cheating think everybody's cheating. That tends to be supported by the literature. One of the more startling findings of the research came when we asked both staff and students how concerned they were that students were engaging in cheating in higher education. And we provided a 5-point Likert scale ranging from not at all concerned through to extremely concerned. Staff most commonly reported being moderately concerned. However, most of the remaining staff were either very or extremely concerned. When we analysed the responses of cheating students had almost the reverse profile. The largest group of students reported that they were only slightly concerned about the existence of cheating in higher ed, and the next largest group were not at all concerned, and only 5% were extremely concerned. When we looked at the responses to this question from non-cheating students, so students who are not cheating, the response profile was almost indistinguishable from that of the cheating group. And what this tells us is that non-cheating students report that cheating is wrong. They agree that it's wrong, but most don't really care that other students are engaging in cheating. They see it as a kind of victimless crime, you know, a phrase that our colleague Kath Ellis uses a lot. And other students are really only cheating themselves when they cheat. They don't see the public risk inherent in cheating, and they don't see other students cheating as devaluing their own degree, their own qualification. So they don't see it as a problem. And it's one of the things we want to support with our resources is how do we get students more concerned about this problem in education. So we next asked staff about a range of organisational factors related to cheating, getting them to report their agreement about whether they think the factors help to minimise third-party cheating at their institution. And the factors included things like policies and procedures and those kinds of things. In terms of positive reporting, staff responses showed that there were 3 factors they thought contributed to minimising contract cheating at their institution. These factors were departmental academic integrity practices, institutional policy and process, and assessment moderation processes. At the other end of the scale were more negative responses, where very few staff agreed and far more staff disagreed that the factors helped to minimise contract cheating. These were teaching workload, student evaluations of teaching, performance management processes, and class sizes. You might recall that we asked students to indicate their level of agreement with 10 teaching and learning practices, 10 statements about teaching and learning practices at their institution. And you might remember that the students in the cheating group reported a far more negative experience on 3 of those factors in particular. Well, we asked staff a similar question, and that was we asked them to rate on a Likert scale how frequently they use these practices in their own teaching and learning. So how often do they implement these things? And so we found that when we analysed the staff data, they identified 3 factors in particular where they rated themselves incredibly highly. That was sort of over 98%, I think it was, or 95% agreement that yes, they implement these things very consistently and very regularly in their own teaching. And it was interesting to us that the 3 things lined up exactly with the 3 things that cheating students report most negatively on. So where cheating students are having the poorest experience relative to non-cheating students, that was where staff felt most confident they were doing a good job. So what we're suggesting here is not that staff are doing a poor job in these areas, far from it, but more that there's a disjuncture between how staff see doing a good job in this area and how students who fall back on cheating practices see doing a good job in this area. So it's an area where we think we'd like to do a bit more qualitative research and dig into this a bit more to try and understand what's going on here in terms of how students and staff understand these practices. So on the subject of assessment design, you might recall that we asked students which types of assessments they'd be more likely to consider outsourcing. And students told us there were 4 task types in particular that were least likely to prompt a consideration of outsourcing. That was reflection on a practicum, personalised and unique tasks, tasks with associated vivas, and in-class assessment. And these 4 assessment features were reported by over 40% of staff as being used rarely or never. So we asked staff how often they use those things in their own assessment, and those 4 rarely or never. The only feature that was used less frequently is short turnaround time. So a short turnaround time is a strategy where you give the student the assignment details on a Monday and it might be due on the Friday. And in fact, it's very good that staff don't use that often because the literature shows that that's likely to prompt more cheating. So yay, we're not doing that. So that's excellent. A final set of questions before the open text item, we asked staff about their own involvement with contract cheating. So in their role as staff, you know, how have you ever been engaged in contract cheating? Have you ever provided students with materials that would allow them to gain an unfair advantage? And only 4 individuals said that they had out of the whole survey group. So that's quite a positive finding. And staff were then asked whether, as students, they had ever engaged in behaviours that would be classified as third-party cheating, and 10% of our staff said yes. So this finding is pretty consistent with other smaller studies where students tend to report somewhere between, I think Tracey said 3 and 8, and staff report a little bit higher. So perhaps on hindsight, staff are a bit more honest, I don't know, about their own behaviour. Certainly while, you know, the literature kind of shows that people who are currently engaged in cheating tend to rationalise or downplay their behaviour. So we thought that was kind of interesting. So I now want to very quickly report some of the findings from our other 2 data sets that Tracey talked about at the beginning, the procurement requests from cheat sites and the institutional breach data. So we use these data sets to look at the question, does authentic assessment design solve contract cheating? Because the OLT, the Office for Learning and Teaching, were really interested in exploring this issue of authenticity and whether authenticity in assessment design could help address the issue of contract cheating. And so what we did was we took, we had a huge data set of procurement notices, hundreds of thousands of procurement notices from these cheat sites, and we took a random sample and we analysed them according to an authenticity framework. We identified 5 factors that indicate authenticity in assessment piece, and we coded all of these assessment tasks for the extent to which they could be considered authentic. And what we found was that we saw a whole range of authenticity factors across the procurement notices on these cheat sites. We saw that what you might call inauthentic assignments, that was an assignment with 0 or maybe only 1 authenticity factor, right through to assignments that had all 5 authenticity factors. You know, they were kind of situated in a workplace, they involved reflection back on work, there was feed-forward elements, things that you would consider to be highly authentic and relevant in that setting with all 5 authenticity factors were outsourced just as frequently as things with low numbers of authenticity factors. So it's, yeah, even highly authentic and personalised tasks can be bought and sold online like any other commodity. The literature has shown that so far, and our survey supports that. We also then looked at institutional breach data with the same question. So we wanted to try and find out, of all the contract cheating that has been detected and substantiated at the 2 universities that we had data from, what kinds of assignments were showing up there. And again, we applied the same coding framework, the same authenticity coding framework, and we found exactly the same thing. Again, assignments with very few authenticity factors, right up to all 5 authenticity factors, highly personalised, highly authentic to the professional context, very future-looking, with a feed-forward element that would impact on future practice, again, outsourced also. So certainly, in terms of our very broad question, which was, does authenticity or can authenticity perhaps solve the problem of contract cheating? Definitively, no. We saw every kind of assignment outsourced online. So one of the interesting things we found, so in our student data, you'll recall that engineering students were very overrepresented in our cheating data set. So they reported rates of cheating much higher than other disciplines. What's been fascinating is they were very underrepresented in the outsourcing notices that we looked at on the cheat sites, and also the detected breaches from the institutional data sets. Engineering didn't feature very much at all as a discipline, and instead social sciences and humanities featured much more, and a couple of other disciplines as well. So this, together with other data, is indicating that cheating behaviours vary quite significantly according to discipline. That in engineering, it's likely to be that students engage in cheating behaviours in a local social network and with prior students, rather than buying things online. It's more of a collusion kind of culture. Other disciplines work differently and are featured much more in the procurement notices. So that was quite interesting too. So quick summary, we absolutely think assessment design remains really important for driving learning and also for minimising opportunities and reasons to cheat, but it's not the answer. Assessment design alone can't solve the problem of contract cheating. It's got to be part of a multifaceted institutional approach. Based on the data we've gathered so far, we think universities should better support this factor that we identified in the data that we've labelled the personalised teaching and learning relationship. The staff data indicates that it's the main signal for picking up contract cheating is when the educator knows the student, and students who are engaging in cheating report that this is where they're least happy in terms of their experience of a teaching and learning environment. It's also important, given the overrepresentation in the cheating group of international and LOTE students, that universities do more to recognise their particular needs and recognise that they're vulnerable in this context. That universities do more to use assignment types that that are likely to minimise opportunities and reasons to cheat, things such as Vivas in-class assessment, reflections on practice and those kinds of things. That we do more to apply appropriate outcomes when contract cheating is identified, and that lecturers are better informed of the process so that referral rates go up, and that whole system of dealing with this and managing this as an issue is strengthened. And then we also support campaigns to get students a bit more concerned about this as a problem, because they're not really very worried about it. So last slide, our next steps. As we said, we're sort of kind of in that middle bubble here. We've just started to identify our key findings, and we're now doing some structural equation modelling on the data. So what you've seen today are sort of some preliminary analysis and factor analysis and some descriptive statistics. We're hoping that structural equation modelling will confirm some of what we've seen. It's already starting to downplay some of the group of 8 that Tracey mentioned. But our next step is to start publishing these findings and then start creating resources that will support the sector in beginning to deal with this issue. So keep informed as we release things and as the project ticks over. We've got a project website, cheatingandassessment.edu.au, and all of our findings are there. We're putting things up there all the time. There's a useful infographic that summarises all the key findings from the project that you can download and print out. So yeah, I think that's all for us. Yeah, you can register to get updates. That's right, from the website. So right, that's all for us.
Thanks very much. That was really fascinating, and I note with some alarm the engineering statistics next time I'm on a bridge or in a building on the 3rd floor. I was also fascinated by the really elevated level of internal, 68% of cheaters in the internal group as opposed to the blended and online.
Yeah,
so
yeah, that was interesting for us. It was a key question because there's, I think the sector has been really worried that moving more into online learning will just lead to cheating just exploding because the students are so anonymous. And actually what we found is that students still by and large cheat using their own local social networks. They cheat with the help of people they know. And so our explanation of that data is that external students are fairly isolated and they're not in contact with that social network. So they have fewer avenues with which to cheat.
That's very interesting. Okay, we've got a couple of questions online. If anyone has a question in the room, I'll get you in a sec. I'll get to you, but there's one from Sven. Have you done any work to determine how your sample underrepresents the incidence of cheating? Surely most students engaging in cheating would avoid admitting it or participating in your survey.
I do too. Oh, do you want to say something, Rowena, or me?
You can.
So the question was that students who are more likely to cheat are less likely to do our survey. Look, that's always, you know, a limitation of a self-report survey. Unfortunately, you get what you get. What we can say is that we had a very large sample. So, you know, including our pathway colleges, over 15,000 students. No one's ever had such a large data set. We also can say that we have a very wide cross-section of different types of universities right across Australia. We can also triangulate that against the international literature, and we can also look at what the staff have said. So I think we can say, yes, students underreport their own cheating behaviours, and it was one of the reasons we asked staff. They said 10% of the time. I think we could probably say, based on the results of the 2 surveys, something between 6 and 10% of students are going to be engaged in one or more of those 5 cheating behaviours. And look, I think the literature across the board supports that.
And I just want to add something really quickly to some other studies take a hypothetical approach. We did on one question, but some other studies take a hypothetical approach and say, would you consider purchasing an assignment? And when you do that, you get quite high rates. You know, over 50% of students saying they'd think about it. What we wanted to ask was, have you ever done it? Have you ever taken a step and done it? So we asked about behaviours, not hypotheticals. And I think that gives you a more accurate data because, you know, it's. I think it's easy to say you might, but when it comes to the crunch, would you really?
The other thing is, in addition to the surveys, we're looking at actual breach reports from universities. We've got 2 large data sets from 2 anonymous universities, but we also know that's completely underreported. So if students are saying 6%, let's say that's a complete underrepresentation, right? 6% are outsourcing their work. And we know most universities, their academic integrity breach data reports account for about 1% of their population. So what we can say, even when we've got the breach reports, is universities, a lot of it's getting past university decision makers. It's not being detected. It's not being addressed. Even though we know that 6% is still very low, we're not getting anywhere near it.
Okay, thanks. Here's a question from Claire.
Thanks. It's Claire H. Very pleased to meet you, Tracy. I'm interested in this area of work in regard to particularly doctoral writing. You didn't look at that at all? Did you collect data on postgrads?
We do. We have data in there from postgraduates, but we haven't pulled it out and analysed it as yet. The way we phrased the questions was, have you ever? So a postgraduate student might say, yes, I have done X, but it may well have been when they were a first or a second year. We didn't look at doctoral writing specifically, but what I think we would like to do at some point is pull out some of the data from those individual cohorts and look at the qualitative comments. Because there was an open text question at the end, and it's already, we're doing some analysis of that, and it's proving to be very telling. So there might be more data in the qualitative information specifically about doctoral writing.
I would respond to that. We don't have the numbers, Claire, but our colleague Kath Ellis, who's in our team, she's been looking at that as well, and she just presented a paper at the World Conference on Research Integrity about contract cheating in HDR. And she and her colleague, do you know the paper? Were you there? Oh, you saw the paper. So she and her colleague have actually been looking specifically at that, and it goes back to, and we don't have the numbers, but it goes back to exactly everything Rowena was saying. Anything can be outsourced, and anything is outsourced, right through from a 2% online contribution right through to a whole PhD thesis. Wow, okay. Oh, that's fun.
Claire just said you can buy a supervisor online, for those that didn't hear. Okay, we have one more question. That's rather a lengthy one from Alison. I study social norms and how social norms relate to behaviour. Can you discuss in more detail why you think the cheating subgroup thought cheating was more popular? Is there a potential that students want to feel like they're engaging in behaviour that is normative? Maybe an intervention that could be implemented would be to highlight how cheating is non-normative and not approved of, to try to reduce the prevalence of cheating.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and that could well be part of a useful strategy, because I think part of it is that students who are engaging in cheating, we know they primarily do it with people they know. And so probably students engaging in cheating probably are surrounded by many other students who are also cheating. So their perception is that lots of students are, because a lot of people they know.
With the data, that's shot out in the data, isn't it? The cheaters perceive that there are more.
Yeah, they perceive there's more, partly because they're probably surrounded by people who are. So yeah, I think part of it is debunking that normative thing, to say, look, actually only a very small percentage of students are doing this. So it's not normative. And I think also pointing out all the reasons why it's really important not to. It sounds like an incredibly kind of, I don't know, paternal, patronising thing to do, but pointing out to students why this is just a really, really damaging road to go down for so many reasons. We've got data from students who don't cheat about why they don't cheat. But I don't know whether those same reasons that those students give will appeal in any way to students who are cheating. You know, I think it's a bit of qualitative work that needs to be done. Is how do you convince a student who's cheating not to?
Thanks very much. Okay, we have one last question from in the room. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. I'm going to be the elephant in the china shop here. I'm going to ask, have you considered actually going back to the basic principles of examinations in classrooms, but wait for it with a twist, to include more workshops that actually get the students to apply the basic principles? So take away the pressure, take it away, you've got 1 hour to do this. It's a simple assessment to make sure the principle, because you've highlighted that in here, that we need to get the principles across. You also highlighted the lecturers need to actually get to know the students. So maybe minimising small workshops to actually get them to do the basic principles and prove it might be. Have you considered that? Or is it going backwards?
Well, yes, yes, and yes.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's been in the literature for a little while, a really good practice is what you call sort of sequential or nested assessment. So that is an assessment task that unfolds in pieces across a semester, where the students perhaps in class have to bring an outline of an essay they're going to write, and the tutor sees it and works with them on it, and they swap it with their peers and they get some feedback. So then the tutor knows what the student's working on and where they're at with it, and they get help with it. Then later in the semester, perhaps they have to submit, part of that essay or a draft. So yeah, I think that sort of leans towards what you're talking about, that in class, building the skills. And then at the end, the student submits the whole essay. And unfortunately, we know that can be outsourced just as easily as anything else. The only benefit is it's easier to detect. If the student has outsourced it, we can pick it up more easily. So there aren't many measures that we know of that will completely eradicate cheating, but some of them are really good for helping the student learn and build skills, and also B, detecting it when it happens.
Totally agree with all of that. Particularly, I have a slide which, in a longer version of this presentation, shows one of these, actually a small commercial provider, showing the fees for an outline, references, all the things that you do in a nested sequence of assessments. So as Rowena says, you can outsource that, but it's still good for learning. Doesn't mean you should throw that baby out with the bathwater. The other thing I could say about that is, of course, we agree that's the type of learning, that's the sort of teaching we all know is effective. Unfortunately, none of us work in that environment anymore. Having worked at UniSA for 17 years and taught a core course of between 500 and 700 students with 14 tutors, and classes that used to have 10 students, now they have 35. In tutorials, they used to be 2 hours, now they're 50 minutes, and now they're flipped, and there's no requirement to come, 2 pieces of assessment in 10 weeks. So unfortunately, we can gather this data, we can create resources which we think will be useful, but I think we have to be mindful of the organisational context in which we work. One of the things I think our challenge is, those 3 factors, that personalised teaching and learning relationship. One of the things, for example, just off the top of my head, the cheating students said they weren't satisfied with how approachable the lecturers were. Well, let's think, in the current context, what we have to think of is, how do we make ourselves more approachable approachable in inverted commas, in an online environment? How do we make ourselves more approachable in 50 minutes? So what does approachability mean in the new environment in which we work? Because everything you said, of course we agree, but any resources we create that suggest we can do that, most of our colleagues will just go, well, what fairyland do you work in? So I think we have to take into account the current context, the new version of higher education we'll work in, taking into account what we've learned from students and from staff, and try to come up with resources that are actually going to be useful. And we welcome your feedback to help us with that, because it's hugely, hugely challenging.
Okay, one last question from online. We have gone a little bit over time, but there's no students waiting to come in, so if you'll indulge us for 5 minutes. Rosemary asks, identification is an issue in exam impersonation and perhaps even in class impersonation. Are any universities considering using identification such as fingerprinting, which has already begun to be used in IELTS testing, for example?
Not that I'm aware of. I did hear a rumour last year that there was a college or a university in the UK somewhere that holds its exams inside a hall that's surrounded by a Faraday cage, so that students can't send signals in and out if they've got their phone in there. So that's pretty hardcore.
Facial recognition.
Well, I don't know of any universities using it, but because of the work I do, I'm on every email list for every type of, forensic linguistics, stylometrics, and biometrics identification. So I know there are companies out there doing exactly that. Irises, fingerprinting, voice. I just recently had a paper submitted to my journal which was looking at online proctoring, and they were doing an analysis of head angle, just to demonstrate that people were actually, even though they had the video right in front of them for the online proctoring, they were actually looking down and cheating. And they did this whole paper on analysis of head angle. So look, all of that. Biometrics, I think, is coming in. I think there's no escaping it. And there are so many companies out there promoting the services. I don't know who's doing it to the person who asked that question, but I think it's happening. Yeah.
Yeah. Excuse me. I've done some teaching. Chad Hapel, by the way. I've done some teaching in Singapore, and they do that around attendance. So when students come into class, and it's offshore teaching from the University of Adelaide to Singapore, and they have to put their fingerprint in and record their name. And I made some jokes about it and said, but you could just cut off someone else's finger. And you know, and they didn't, that wasn't taken all that well, but it's definitely around attendance. So it's making sure that you attend, because we know how important attendance is.
Yeah. Part of me think that's tackling the problem at the wrong end. It's because a lot of the, you know, look at who's overrepresented in our data. Many international students with English as a second language. Most students, not all, but most students who are engaging in cheating, we think, are students who are struggling academically, who are struggling to actually understand what it is that their university programs require of them, and so fall back on cheating as a strategy. And so I think if we're going to take this problem seriously, we have to take that problem seriously.
Yeah. But I would just finally say I agree. But I don't think there's any one answer. The thing we've been saying consistently is it's a multi-pronged, holistic approach. Yes, we do that. Maybe there is a place for some biometrics and some proper identification. I think there has been exam impersonation, which hasn't been picked up because we haven't taken that issue seriously in the past. Let's do all of the above. Let's do all of the above, because how horrendous to think that people are actually engaging in exam impersonation, particularly in the professions where that's going to have a huge impact. So, you know, and everywhere, what am I saying, any discipline. But, you know, from the beginning, right from where we recruit our students and our admissions processes, right through to graduation and everything in between.
Okay, thank you very much. That was fascinating. Thanks. And thanks to everybody online. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.